With his latest incursion into Russia, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is dogging the West, insulting them, saying they're not giving him enough stuff, and that, by the way, you're pretty naive for even worrying about what Russia's going to do because Russia's so weak. Is that the case? Is Russia really weak, and is Ukraine now in the driver's seat? Because a lot of people are saying that. Well, we have nobody better than Colonel Doug Macgregor, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, a highly decorated combat veteran and just all-around smart guy to help us unpack that. Doug, welcome back to the show.
Happy to be with you.
Well, you may not have a lot of thoughts on this subject. I don't know what you may be thinking, but I just want to get into some of this because there's just been some really crazy stuff. And just for those who may not have seen, I want to just real quick show the map of what's been going on when we say that they've made an incursion into Russia. It sounds like they've invaded the country, but when you look at this map, like the Institute for the Study of War, which of course has terrible analysis but really good maps. When you look at this map, it looks like, wow, that's a lot of territory. There's allegedly like up to several hundred square kilometers. It sounds a lot, but when you look at that lower right-hand corner and you see that the area of detail of the map, it's almost so small it doesn't show up. So it's relatively small in strategic terms, even operational terms, but you can't dismiss it. So it has been some fairly embarrassing, I think, for the Russian side. Now, I wonder, first of all, before I even get into some of the details, just what are your thoughts on the fact that Ukraine was able to pull off this much, and what does it actually mean?
I'm not surprised that they found a hole in the border area, and it's not really a hole. You know, this is a border of about 1,000 kilometers, and much of it, this is, in other words, between Ukraine and Russia, much of it is densely forested with rivers, hills, and there are many areas in Ukraine that simply don't have very many people living in them. Most of the population in Russia and Ukraine is concentrated, frankly, in the larger cities. Between the cities, the roads and bridges and so forth aren't always the best, but there are actually relatively few villages. In this particular area where they chose to penetrate, there was almost no one. And I think they had perhaps 50 policemen that were stationed in the area. So it was easy to penetrate, but they weren't able to achieve their objective. And their objective, as you know, was to reach Kursk and the Kursk nuclear power plant, ostensibly to capture it and hold it as a bargaining chip, presumably because the Russians have controlled the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant almost from the beginning of the war. And the Ukrainians thought that they could capture this thing and they might be able to make some capital out of it, or worse, they could cause an accident that would do enormous damage. In any case, they got about 25 miles and were stopped dead in their tracks as the Russians began assembling strike forces as well as maneuver forces to stop them.
Now, it's interesting in terms of what has happened, because this has been portrayed as a big embarrassment for the Russian side. And I think to a certain extent it probably is. But the Western media especially has been hyping this up, that this has changed the nature of the war. Now Russia's on its back foot. And there's actually people suggesting that Putin may now be forced to make a negotiated settlement because of this small incursion. Number one, on the surface of it, it just seems absurd in a 2.5-year war for one moment like this for people to think anything's going to happen. But part of that is fed because of Volodymyr Zelensky, who the New York Times today published a part of a speech that he gave to a bunch of ambassadors to Ukraine, where he is basically saying the West and saying, hey, you guys are naive. In fact, this article, which came out just a couple of hours ago, says the whole naive, illusory concept of so-called red lines regarding Russia, which dominated the assessment of the war by some partners, has crumbled, past tense, these days somewhere near Sudzha. Mr. Zelensky told the Ukrainian ambassadors, Russia's slow response to Ukraine's incursion should signal to the world that Russia is not the fearsome superpower it once appeared to be. Mr. Zelensky noted it is time when the West is shredding its last and very naive illusions about Russia. He went on to say, also echoing something he wrote yesterday that was published in Politico, where he said, hey, fork over the weapons, man. We're doing great on all fronts, but you guys need to give us the weapons faster. And then he called out the United States, United Kingdom, and France by name and said, hey, man, let's go ponying up. I guess I just wonder, first of all, Doug, I guess your analysis of what Zelensky could be thinking, and what does he think he's going to get accomplished by this?
Is born every minute. And I think that Mr. Zelensky is very much in the Barnum category. He realizes he's dealing with a lot of suckers in the West, at least in part because, as Mike Benz and others has taught us, we're not getting the truth in the West about anything regarding Ukraine, or for that matter, anything that our respective governments don't want us to hear. And right now in Europe, as well as in the United States, we have official narratives that are picked up by the mainstream media and then essentially disseminated without question. And they're almost all false. There's very little truth in any of them. That's certainly the case here. Let's look at what has actually happened. The total number of forces that were involved in this on the Ukrainian side turned out to be about 12,000. Initially, 1,000 went in. They discovered how light the resistance was, and they poured in an additional 11,000 troops. Right now, we estimate that close to 3,500 to 4,000 have been killed or wounded. We now know that all of the heavy equipment, tanks, artillery, radars, missiles, everything that they brought with them has been destroyed. Most of it by Iskander missiles, a tactical ballistic missile system the Russians employ that carries about a 1,200-pound warhead, different kinds of warheads for different purposes, including fuel-air explosive. These have annihilated all of the heavy equipment. At the same time, they moved to the area a number of Chechen forces on one side, Wagner military types on the other, and then the so-called Russian Volunteer Corps. They have cut the remaining Ukrainian troops off from their route that they were going to try to use to get back into Ukraine. So now, whatever is left of that 12,000, which is probably 4,000 or 5,000 uninjured with others scattered, is fighting for its very life as it's being systematically annihilated with strikes and maneuver forces. So this thing was a debacle. It was a catastrophe because they used whatever new equipment they had, and all of that is virtually gone right now. The sad part is they used a lot of Western equipment, including British tanks, Bradleys. I don't know if there were any more German Leopards in it, but of course this leaves the Russians with a very bad taste in their mouth. And as I'm sure you're aware, they showed some Ukrainian soldiers pretending to be German soldiers in the Second World War, running around with German helmets, making stupid comments in German to local Russian citizens. All of this is sort of spitting in the face, in the eyes of the Russian people and the Russian state. Now, what does this mean? It means that they've lost most of these people and all of this equipment. Does it do anything militarily for Ukraine? Nothing. In fact, it weakens Ukraine even more than it is already weakened. But something else very dangerous has occurred. I just sat with someone who lived in Russia for 15 years, had a relatively fresh perspective on all of this. And this particular lady told me that the Russian population is now united in a way that no one has seen in decades. Remember that within Russia itself, there are about 174 different ethnic groups. We find that hard to comprehend, but there are many Mongolian, Tartar, Turkic peoples who have very distinct identities, rich histories, extensive cultural foundations that are part of Russia simply because there were very few of them. And when the final borders were drawn, they happened to be inside Russia. The Russians have treated them well. And Mr. Putin has been extremely careful to ensure that all of these people have equal rights before the law, which, of course, is one of the reasons that he took the Russian army into eastern Ukraine to begin with, to make sure that the Russian citizens living on Ukrainian soil would also be treated equally. Of course, that turned out to be a farce. And as a result, he's had to stay where he is and protect the Russians that live inside Ukraine. But something else has happened now, and that is that this population in Russia is enraged, furious, much more enraged and furious than people in the West understand. And they are literally publicly calling for President Putin to march west and essentially cross the river, smash whatever is in Ukraine and regain complete control of it, which frankly is something that President Putin doesn't want to do. He never has. He was ever only interested in the Russians who were living inside Ukraine and ensuring that they would not be brutalized or mistreated. Unfortunately, we have a situation now where the population says that's obviously not enough. We'll have no peace. There will be no sleep at night as long as Western Ukraine remains a permanent source of conflict and hostility to Russia. So what we've done, I think, is awaken a beast, a very serious beast that we grossly underestimated from the beginning. We don't understand that one of the reasons Russian forces have moved so deliberately was not just because they wanted to avoid unnecessary casualties. They never really wanted to go any further than they had to liberate the Russians. Secondly, they don't want to rule or govern or control Ukrainians. They're not fools. They want the Ukrainians to govern themselves. They simply want the place to be neutral and not a threat to Russia, which we have obviously fought against almost from the very beginning, stupidly.
And you know, Doug, I think it's really telling that on I think right before our D-Day celebrations, Putin came out and offered one more, which no one really thought the West would take, but I think he just said this is basically a ultimatum or last chance opportunity of negotiated settlement. He said he would settle for the 4 oblasts as long as the Ukraine side withdrew out of that, et cetera. And that was, worse than the one from April of 2022. But now then, once this incursion happened, I think it was the deputy chief of the UN mission for the Russian side said that's now off the table. There is nothing else that we're going to talk about except for military victory. And I've heard that from others. So it seems to support what you're saying, that this incursion not only will not harm Russia, but it will eventually harm Ukraine even more.
Well, I think two things we have to keep in mind. First of all, contrary to whatever Mr. Zelensky says publicly, privately, we know his bags are packed. He's moved his billions into bank accounts in places like Cyprus, Albania, Switzerland. He's bought estates in Italy. He's got a place here in Florida, where not far from where I am in Orlando. He's ready to go. And as soon as it becomes obvious to him that the Russians are advancing on him, he's going to be on a plane, and he'll probably pack that with whatever cash is left, just as we saw in Afghanistan. Some of your viewers will remember that people left Afghanistan and that corrupt government with carloads of U.S. cash. I think you're going to see something very similar when the time comes with Mr. Zelensky. That is, of course, if the Ukrainians, who are increasingly sick of him, contrary to what we're told in the mainstream media, don't bump him off, which I think is a real possibility. In fact, it may be Ukrainian soldiers who have been paying a horrible price in this war that eventually dispose of him. But there's something else that the audience needs to understand. The Germans in particular, I know the Germans overwhelmingly want nothing to do with a war against Russia. Contrary to what people have said, they are absolutely not Nazis. They're not interested in that. If anybody doesn't want anything to do with National Socialism and Nazism, it's the Germans. True for the Austrians. It's true, as far as I can tell, with everybody. So I think it's time for the governments in Germany and other countries to be removed. And the electorates have to stand up. They have to stand up to these terrible, corrupt governments that have been proselytizing for us, pushing lies and bad policies on our behalf, and get rid of them. Because if they don't, they could end up at the other end of an unfortunate accident that could result in more destruction for Europe. Because I think the Russians have really had it. Their patience is worn thin. Now I think you're going to see what everybody talked about as being inevitable, which never was. The Russians will come forward and smash these people once and for all.
Yeah, I all the evidence corroborates what you were saying there. It has from the beginning that Putin was always looking for a negotiated settlement, but that does appear to have changed right now. And I wonder if you could touch on one other aspect of this. You said at the outset here that as obviously the Ukrainian objective was this or that, but they have actually changed what they have said several times. And I wonder if you can kind of read the tea leaves here and tell me what you think they were really after, because Zelensky at first just said, well, this is to cause pain to Russia like they caused pain to us. And then he said, well, actually, no, this is to get at a better condition for a negotiated settlement. And now he says that, no, this is actually a buffer area, to saying the same thing that Russia said when they went in north of Kharkiv. And then now some other people are saying, no, we're actually going to try and take this, the nuclear power plant or something to get more leverage. But I mean, when you look at this, the country of Russia, and you're talking even if the number was 20,000 total Ukrainian troops, obviously you can't invade a country and then keep the lines of communication open, keep the flanks secured. I mean, you just can't do that with those few troops. So the question is, what was really their objective?
Well, I still think the objective was to get to the Kursk nuclear power plant, Dan. I think that was really the goal. Of course, there was very little chance of achieving that, though they did pick an area where they knew there was almost no one present to resist them. And they hoped that they could exploit this. I think that's true. Now, that's failed miserably. The notion that they're going to hold on to anything is absurd. This is a vast tract of dense forest, very few inhabitants. The Russians are going to clean them out. That is, assuming that any of them live through what's about to happen to the rest of them. This is over, and this has harmed Ukraine badly. It's harmed its military capability, it's harmed its position in the world, and it's harmed us. But sadly, I think this was an idea cooked up at NATO. And it seems as though the British had a big hand in this, as did the Americans. And again, we know that it was NATO that kept pushing, primarily British and Americans, to continually attack Russian defenses, which made no sense. This made no sense. This was worse than a gamble. This is just a wasteful exercise in disposing of whatever good troops you had left. And remember, we're hearing reports that perhaps as many as 2,000 of these troops may have been British and Americans in Ukrainian uniform, operating either as mercenaries or whatever. You know, they talk about sheep dipping people and moving them between the CIA and the U.S. Armed Forces. Maybe this is another move to move them from the U.S. Armed Forces directly into the Ukrainian force. And we also know there were numbers of Polish troops, although I'm surprised, given the heavy losses that the Poles have taken, that they would go back in again for another serious beating. So this is a catastrophe. This is not good. And anyone who believes anything that Zelensky says needs to see a psychiatrist. There is no truth in anything this man says, or for that matter, has ever said.
Well, and then that's I guess brings us to another point here directly related to that, because what he has said publicly was that this was all our idea. We didn't coordinate with anybody else. In fact, we kept them in the dark. Americans are mad, but it's just something that we had to do. But someone else doesn't believe that, and it's the Russian foreign minister when he said this.
Всем прекрасно понятно, что никогда Зеленский не решился бы на это. А это, безусловно, Зеленского решение. Как он сейчас хвалится, что создает буферную зону, наносит ущерб российскому государству. Никогда бы он на это не решился, если бы ему не поручили Соединенные Штаты Америки. Так же, как Соединенные Штаты Америки, теперь уже ни у кого сомнений нет, стоят за взрывами северных потоков, которые взрывы оставили Европу без дешевого российского топлива и, соответственно, без устойчивой основы экономического развития.
Okay, so here's the question. If Russia does believe that, and at this point, it almost doesn't matter whether it's true or not. It only matters what they believe, and certainly there's a lot of plausibility behind it. But what is going to be the consequence in any actions that Russia may take? Because if they believe that the U.S. was behind this, not just using American weapons into Russian territory, but now actually promoting an armed incursion into the country, what might they do in response to it in terms of the United States?
Well, whenever we ask that question, we tend to move or migrate in the direction of what I would call dumb answers. Someone will stand up and say, well, they're obviously going to escalate to the nuclear level. No, that's ridiculous. They have no interest in doing that. They, under no circumstances, want to challenge us or confront us on the nuclear level. Absolutely not. They're also not necessarily interested in attacking NATO bases in Eastern Europe. They just don't want to widen the war. But there are things that they can do that we refer to as horizontal escalation. They have ties and sources of interest all over Europe, as well as in the Middle East and Asia. They can cause us misery and harm economically, even militarily, in ways that we don't have the preparation to deal with it. We recently had an example of this in Bulgaria. A substantial logistical strong point or concentration point for U.S. and NATO forces was attacked and destroyed. A lot of materiel was lost. And people said, well, these were discontented Bulgarians. Well, that may have been true, but let's not be foolish. That is something that could be executed all across Central East Europe, from the Black Sea all the way to the Baltic Sea. In other words, they have the ability to attack, destroy, not just in cyberspace, but physically, things that are of real importance to us in terms of sustaining our military presence and our influence. So, we've talked about, Russia's control and influence over North Korea. Russia can pull a string, hit a button, and suddenly North Korea begins to rattle sabers, threatens to use a nuclear weapon, all the usual sort of thing. They can do things in Central Asia that we haven't even begun to think about. So the point is, they will act against us. We will be harmed in many ways, but there will be no direct military confrontation, which I think is what the fools in Washington look for. They're not interested in it. We shouldn't be interested in it.
Yeah, we definitely shouldn't be interested in it. And I wonder if, I fear that a lot of these people in the United States, in the so-called elite, and I hate to even say it out loud, but like Lindsey Graham, and he only because he's on TV all the time, not that he has any intellectual more compass and capabilities, but he was gleeful in talking about this thing and said, yeah, let's go kick Putin's ass and all this kind of stuff. I don't think he's aware of that, because when he doesn't see Putin do that, when he doesn't see him take kinetic action, then he thinks that there is no reaction, even though you had earlier today, Vladimir Putin said this.
Что касается вот тех противников и врагов наших, которых я вспоминал, то они продолжают эту работу с попыткой раскачать нашу страну. Это очевидно. И так как мы боролись с террористами, нам сегодня приходится бороться с теми, кто творит преступления в Курской области, в Донбассе, в Новороссии. Но так же, как в борьбе с терроризмом мы добились своих целей, мы добьемся этих целей и на этом направлении, в борьбе с неонацизмом. И, безусловно, покараем преступников. В этом.
Now, he was talking to a group of family members from the Beslan terrorist attack from, I think, 20 years ago or 15 years ago. I can't remember when it was, but it was a horrible situation where a lot of school children were killed in a terrorist attack. And he was saying, just like we dealt with that back then, we're going to deal with it now. And he's talking about this incursion into his country like it's a terrorist attack similar to that. And when you hear that, when you see like Lindsey Graham, these kind of people talking when they don't see Putin launch into an attack that they think he's not going to. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think he's being very straightforward from his vantage point. This was never a serious military operation because it had zero chance of being successful. So from his vantage point, it really is a terrorist attack. They moved into the territory. They terrorized the people that they encountered. They inflicted whatever modest damage that they could, and then they planned to withdraw because they could never reach their objective, whatever their original purpose was, which I still think was the nuclear power plant. So he's saying we'll treat it as a terrorist attack, and I would expect that lots of people in Ukraine who have connections to this, and probably some NATO officers and personnel on the ground in Ukraine that had something to do with this, will end up dead as a result. And we'll see the Russians over time exact a price. But as I say, it will not be what we anticipate or expect.
And in terms of the cost to the Ukraine side to achieve these objectives, I agree that getting to the nuclear power plant was a bridge too far, to use some old military jargon. So it seems absurd to me that anyone would have given this any possibility of a military success, even a tactical, much less an operational success, But I think that there's an even bigger immediate cost. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. And that is in the east, because in just the last 36 hours or so, Russia has made some pretty significant advances in the Kursk area, the Toretsk, and even in the Kupiansk this morning. And it seems to me that those, whatever the number was, 15, 20,000 that were used up there and all this new equipment could have been a lot more effective in the east, but now they don't have it.
Well, perhaps, but I don't think there's a great deal that Ukraine can do now. Russia essentially has a free hand. It can move and strike wherever it wants to go. The question now on the desk for President Putin is, how much longer do we wait before we move forward and effectively snuff out, exterminate this regime in Kiev? Because from their vantage point, this is a terrorist regime. We've set them up. Their sole purpose from the very beginning, at least in Washington, was to inflict harm on Russia. In other words, to harm and terrorize Russia and its people. Insane as that sounds to most Americans, because I don't think most Americans paid much attention from the beginning, and were all too ready to believe bad things about Russians based on decades of Cold War experience. Sadly, they didn't pay much attention. Well, they better pay attention now. This is a very serious matter. And we are truly overstretched. We have about a third of the United States Navy sitting in the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. We have tens of thousands of servicemen, Army, Marine, Air Force, all over the region. This is a very dangerous situation, because why would you, if you had any influence right now, as Mr. Putin obviously does, why would you exercise restraint towards them? When have we given him an incentive to either believe anything we say, or more important, to refrain from damaging us? I think we're very fortunate to this point that worse things have not happened to us, including here in the Western Hemisphere.
And I want to slightly shift gears on that to look at the U.S. aspect of this. Because it's in many ways, this is the even more alarming in terms of who's in charge and who wants to be in charge in the next election. Gary, I'm going to change up the order here a little bit. If you could go with that in a second here, the second Biden clip that I talked about with 10 days before Kissinger passed, when he called him. Doug, what you're going to hear is this is a campaign speech. It was at the Democratic convention in Chicago last night by Biden. He's trying to rally the Democratic faithful, et cetera. But he's talking about some things here, which I think is fairly true about what he believes and what he thinks. Now, I want you to listen to this comment that he made here about Napoleon, because I'm not sure that it plays out the way that he's thinking. Watch this.
10 days before he died, Henry Kissinger called and said, not since Napoleon has Europe not looked over their shoulder at Russia with dread until now. Until now. Well, guess what? Putin thought he'd take Kyiv in 3 days. 3 years later, Ukraine is still free.
Okay, first of all, Biden says that all the time about the Putin thought in 3 days, but it was actually Biden's chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, who said that that Ukraine would fall in 3 days if they invaded, which even at the time was a strange thing to say, given the number of forces that were available to Ukraine, to Russia. I don't think that was ever their intention, was to militarily take Kiev. Maybe scare them, but certainly not to take them. But so that's his justification on the one hand. But I think citing Napoleon as the last time Russia was or Europe wasn't worried, but they should have been, because Napoleon failed and lost in Russia. So I'm really not sure where he was going with that. But that's the mentality of the current administration, and that worries me.
Well, their grasp of history, what did or did not happen, and how things turned out, is very poor. Again, as we've discussed in the past, before we did any of these things, no one did a serious strategic analysis of Russian capabilities, Russian strength, Russian potential. We focused on what we thought was true. You know, the old idea of a gas station with nuclear weapons. That's utter nonsense. So I think he's echoing these sentiments. But let's be fair to Biden. I don't think he ever thought seriously about any of it. I think he simply said or done whatever he was told to say or do. I think he signed whatever was put in front of him. And then let's stop for a second and go back to the 20th of July. This General Cavoli, I think is his name, the Supreme Commander of Europe, made some really absurd comments talking about Ukraine has a really good strategic plan to win this war. This is on 20 July.
Yeah.
What planet are these people on? And
Right.
somebody said to me, is this man delusional or is he stupid? I said, no, he's not stupid. He's an intelligent man. I don't think he's delusional. He's lying. And that's the problem now. We have lied. I say we, I'm talking about the United States government. It's allied governments in Europe with the support, the collusion, the willing co-conspiracy of the mainstream media. They have lied repeatedly about everything. They're lying now about the Middle East. They're lying about what's happening in Eastern Europe. It's very dangerous because the truth will out, and it's beginning to come out. It's beginning to seep out, which is why you see demonstrations all over Germany, not just in Berlin, but in all the major cities against this war. There are good reasons for that. People have begun to find out what's happening. And of course, their lives have been destroyed. Their economy is ruined, all because we dragged them into this confrontation, which was never required.
There's, I get your point there about the stupid delusion or lies, but I'll tell you one that probably falls into the delusion category, which in some ways is worse than the lies, because if he believes what I'm about to show you here, and I think that he does, because he said a lot of this stuff a lot, this leads to lots of opportunity for strategic miscalculation with potentially catastrophic results. This is, again, Biden from last night talking about how he sees America in the world.
Name me a country in the world that doesn't think we're the leading nation in the world. Without America, not a joke, think about it. I'm being literal. Who could lead the world other than the United States of America? Well, guess what? America's winning, and the world's better off for it.
Wow. America is winning. We're running the world, and the world is better off because of it. I mean, none of those things are accurate. In fact, it's the exact opposite. Everywhere you want to look in Europe, in the Middle East, in the Indo-Pacific, I mean, our positions are worsening by the day, and yet he thinks we're the most powerful country, and the world is following in our footsteps. That is dangerous.
In his defense, he is not the Lone Ranger. He has a lot of company inside the Beltway. The country he describes doesn't exist anymore. That was the country you and I knew in 1990 and 91.
Yep.
The country today is very different, and Americans don't have any control over their government. They're bystanders. They're watching other people make policy decisions. In some cases, life or death decisions in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, as well as here at home with the border, and they're never consulted. They're never asked anything. They're just told to shut up and color. And unfortunately, because things here have been good, we've had a high standard of living, we live well, Americans have tended to be complacent. Well, those days are over. Our standard of living is falling. It could fall very precipitously, depending what happens in the financial markets. And again, when you walk around and you talk to people, some of whom consider themselves to be experts, you still hear people say, there's nothing wrong. We can always print more money. And as long as we can print more money, we can carry this debt in perpetuity. We've got nuclear weapons. No one is going to challenge us. The possibility that we have a nuclear stalemate where any use of a nuclear weapon will result in what we all know is mutual assured destruction. Suddenly, nuclear weapons are not useful. They're not usable. And if they are used, the world will draw back from whomever has initiated a nuclear strike, and that particular country will be a pariah and probably will end up being destroyed. So no, he could not be more remote from reality. But again, inside the Beltway, you would think it is still 1990, and you have the same cheering sections with people, I call them the Bombs Away Club, who think that every time we bomb someone somewhere, our greatness is demonstrated. Well, that's not true. The world is really sick of us. That's why you have BRICS. That's why you have 84 countries standing around ready to join BRICS. That's why Saudi Arabia has buried the hatchet with Iran and vice versa. It's why they're trying to build an alternative to the Suez Canal that runs from the Indian Ocean in Iran all the way up through the Caucasus, through Azerbaijan, into Russia, and then ultimately Europe. People don't want to be bothered with us. We are more trouble than we are worth. We have caused them unnecessary misery and harm. So we don't enjoy the position he described anymore. We need to come to terms with that. But to do that, we have to change our behavior. And right now, no one in Washington is willing to do that.
Right. Yeah, that's unfortunate and that's one of the reasons we are doing shows like this. I know you're on a lot of different networks and channels doing the same kind of thing. So at least people can at least be aware of the risk and the things that are going on so that maybe we can get more people waking up.